What happens when two men who will not speak to each other jointly own the largest ranch in America? In Vernon, Texas, they kept offices across the hall inside the W.T. Wagoner Estate building, controlling roughly 510,000 acres behind a single fence, 6 counties, nearly 800 square miles, larger than Los Angeles and New York City combined. Their main way of communicating was written memos. In April 1991, one branch of the family asked a district judge to sell the whole thing. What followed took 25 years, and the woman who started it didn't live to see how it ended. Let me show you the building first, because it tells you almost everything. The W.T. Wagoner Estate building sits in Vernon, in North Texas, about 175 miles northwest of Dallas. Inside it, according to reporting in the Land Report, A.B. Bucky Wharton III and Jean Willingham, who had married E. Paul Wagoner's granddaughter Helen Biggs, worked directly across a hallway from each other. They represented the two branches of the family that jointly controlled the estate, and their principal means of communication was memos, in writing, carried across that hall. Not a feud playing out in courtrooms hundreds of miles apart. Two men, one corridor, running one of the most valuable properties in the United States without speaking. Now here's the thing that makes this more than a family drama. Out on the ranch itself, the work never stopped. Cattle were still being worked twice a year by the wagon crew. Fences were still being ridden. Water was still being checked in 15 separate camps spread across the property. A ranch that size doesn't get to pause while its owners argue. So you had a functioning operation, generations of expertise, oil under the ground and grass on top of it, and an ownership structure that had quietly become unworkable. And that gap is the whole subject of this story. We tend to imagine ranches dying the way they die in films, a drought that lasts 3 years, a blizzard, a bank calling in a note, a fire. Those things happen and they hurt. But go through the record of America's great ranches and you find something far less cinematic doing most of the killing. The land keeps producing, the cattle keep calving, and the ownership quietly becomes arithmetic that no longer resolves. How does that happen to a place that had survived for over a century? Go back to 1849. That's the year Dan Wagoner is generally credited with establishing the operation, though some sources put the founding at 1852. He came to Texas from Tennessee, and he built. By the end, his holdings spanned 8 North Texas counties, and he owned 5 banks, 3 cottonseed oil mills, and a coal company. His son, William Thomas Wagoner, known as Tom, expanded it further. And Tom is where the story turns because of something that happened while he was drilling. He was drilling for water. In that country, water is the constraint on everything. Grass without water is useless because cattle will walk themselves to death looking for a drink. So Tom Wagoner put down wells looking for the thing that would let him run more animals on more acres. What he hit was oil. According to Western Horseman, his first reaction was disgust. He wanted water and he got a black mess that ruined the whole. That reaction sounds absurd now, and I want to be careful. It comes down to us as a story rather than a documented quote. But it makes complete sense in context. In the 1890s, an oil strike on your cattle ranch was a problem, not a fortune. There was limited demand and no easy way to move it. By the 1920s, automobiles had changed that arithmetic completely, and the Wagoner Ranch was sitting on one of the more productive stretches of North Texas. And notice what the oil did to the succession problem, because this is counterintuitive. Money usually solves family disputes. Here it made them worse. A cattle operation is hard to value and harder to split, but its income is modest and unpredictable, which tends to keep heirs realistic about what they're fighting over. Oil income changes that. Suddenly, the property throws off serious cash regardless of rain, which means an heir who has no interest in ranching still has an enormous financial interest in the ranch. The oil gave people a reason to stay attached to something they didn't want to run. Which brings us to 1923 and the decision this entire story rests on. Tom Waggoner created the W.T. Waggoner Estate, a trust that held the entire property as a single undivided entity with his 3 children as beneficiaries, Guy, E. Paul, and Electra. Understand what he was trying to prevent. Tom Waggoner had watched what happened to big properties when a founder died. The land goes to the children have children. Within 2 generations, you have a crowd of relatives who each own a slice of everything and a specific piece of nothing. He built a structure to stop that, and for 2 generations, it worked exactly as intended. The ranch stayed whole. Guy, E. Paul, and Electra were beneficiaries of a single entity rather than owners of separate pastures, and the fence line never moved. Here's what it couldn't stop. I need to explain undivided interests, because this is the mechanism that has taken apart more great American ranches than drought, fire, and cattle prices combined. When multiple heirs share ownership of a property, they typically don't each own a mapped piece of it. They own a percentage of the whole. Nobody can point at a pasture and say that one is mine. Everybody owns a fraction of every acre, every fence post, every well. That arrangement is perfectly functional as long as the co-owners agree. It becomes a loaded gun the moment they don't, because any co-owner has the right to go to court and demand a partition, a legal division of the shared property. The court's first preference is to physically divide the land. But when the property can't be split fairly, which is nearly always true of a working ranch, the remedy changes. The court orders it sold, and the money gets divided instead. So one heir out of many can force the sale of a property that everyone else wants to keep, not because they own the majority, because they own a share and want out. That right exists for good reasons, incidentally. Without it, a single stubborn co-owner could trap everyone else's capital in an asset forever with no way to access their own money. The law is trying to protect people from being held hostage by their relatives. It just happens that when the asset is a 500,000-acre ranch, the protection functions like a demolition charge, and the Waggoner was almost uniquely impossible to divide. Think about what was actually on that property. More than 1,000 oil wells, something like 7,000 cattle, around 500 horses, roughly 26,000 to 30,000 acres of cropland growing grain, mansions, aircraft hangars, stables, reservoirs including Lake Kemp, which provided public recreation. Now try to cut that into 2 fair halves. And remember the fence, because it isn't decoration. A single continuous boundary is what lets cattle be moved across the whole property as one system, following grass and water through the seasons. Split it, and you don't get 2 smaller versions of the same ranch. You get 2 operations that each need their own headquarters, their own equipment, their own water plan, and their own crew. Which side gets the oil wells, and what happens when one field produces and another doesn't? Which side gets the water? Which gets the headquarters, the stables, the equipment? Gene Willingham's documented position was precisely this. An even division would be too complicated given the nature of the assets. That wasn't obstruction. It was probably correct. The very thing that made the Waggoner famous, that it sat behind one continuous fence as a single working unit, is what made it legally impossible to separate. And underneath the ownership question was a whole society of people whose lives didn't depend on who won. The ranching operation ran as 15 camps, each somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 acres. A family lived at each camp. Their job was the livestock, the fences, and the water in that section, every day, year-round. Twice a year, the wagon crew came through and worked the cattle at each camp. By the modern era, a helicopter was used alongside cowboys on horses during roundup, simply because covering 800 square miles on horseback takes time nobody has. And that arrangement is more fragile than it sounds. A camp family isn't a set of employees who clock out. Their house, their water, their children's school run, and their entire working life sit inside a boundary owned by somebody else. They have deep knowledge of one specific stretch of country where cattle drift in a norther, which tank goes dry first, and which crossing washes out, and none of that knowledge transfers anywhere else. It's worth everything on that ranch and almost nothing off it. That's 15 households, plus headquarters staff, plus the oil operations. The estate was the major employer in the area around Vernon. Cowboys and their families had lived their entire lives on the property. There's one detail I keep coming back to. In 1945, E. Paul Wagoner bought a quarter-horse stallion named Poco Bueno for $5,700. Poco Bueno became a grand champion at the major stock shows Fort Worth, Denver, Kansas City, and the State Fair of Texas. When he died, E. Paul's will directed that he be buried standing up across from the ranch entrance. A man wrote into his will where a horse should be buried and how. That's the kind of attachment we're talking about. It's also, I think, a clue about why this family couldn't just take the money. Then, in April 1991, the structure broke. Electra Wagoner Biggs, Tom Wagoner's granddaughter, a well-known sculptor whose work includes the Will Rogers statue at Texas Tech, asked the district court to sell the estate and distribute the proceeds to its shareholders. Bucky Wharton countered with an offer of his own. He wanted to keep the ranch operating. The Associated Press photographed the two of them that same month, described as the controlling shareholders of a 500,000-acre estate with a breakup possibly near. What nobody photographing them in 1991 could have known is that the case would still be unresolved a quarter of a century later. And I don't think either side was behaving unreasonably, which is what makes this genuinely sad rather than simply ugly. One branch held an interest in an illiquid asset and wanted to convert it into money they could actually use. The other branch wanted to keep operating a ranch their family had run since before the Civil War. Both positions are legitimate. There was simply no instrument that could deliver both. Here's why it stalled so completely. The suits and countersuits piled up in the 46th Judicial District Court, first before Judge Tom Neely and later before Judge Dan Mike Bird. To oversee the estate while the litigation ground on, the court designated Wilson Freiberg as receiver. Meanwhile, and this is the part that reveals how the outside world saw this property, wealthy buyers traveled to Vernon from across Texas and around the country to court the family. Media moguls, oil barons, millionaires and billionaires. According to the land report, none of them could buy it. Rick Perry's assessment was that the contentious heirs and the nebulous price made a sale impossible. Sit with that. Some of the richest people in America wanted this ranch, had the money for it, and could not purchase it. Not because it wasn't for sale, because nobody could establish who had the authority to sell or what the price was. And a receivership is its own slow damage. A receiver's job is to preserve the asset, not to grow it, which means the answer to almost every proposal is no. No major capital projects, no long-range breeding program, no expansion into a neighboring property that comes available on a ranch where a decision about genetics or grass takes 10 years to show a result. Running in that mode for 2 decades has a real cost that never appears as a line item anywhere. The estate at the time of the dispute was valued at roughly $330 million, with the land alone at around $110 million. And on April 23, 2001, Electra Wagoner Biggs died in a hospital in Vernon. She had filed the lawsuit 10 years earlier. She would not see its resolution for another 15. Her descendants inherited her position in the case, which is exactly how these disputes metastasize, the original parties die, and the litigation continues without them. I want to widen the lens here, because if this were a one-off, it would be a curiosity rather than a pattern. It isn't a one-off. The 4 Sixes Ranch, down in King County, passed through 4 generations of single-line inheritance without ever fragmenting. Then Ann Burnett Marion died in February 2020, and her will directed the ranching operation be sold. It went to market and closed in January 2022 to a group led by Taylor Sheridan. No feud, no lawsuit, just no successor. The XIT 3 million Panhandle acres was deliberately dismantled and sold off to farmers, with the last land gone by 1963. The Matador sold in 1951, its Texas holdings broken up among multiple buyers. The specifics differ every time. A will here, a partition suit there, a syndicate liquidating to pay bondholders somewhere else. What repeats is the timing. The founder assembles it. The second generation, who watched the assembling happen, holds it together. The third generation inherits an asset they didn't build, often alongside cousins they barely know. And by then, the shares have been cut fine enough that someone always needs the money more than they need the land. 4 enormous Texas ranches, 4 different routes, same destination. Then there's the exception, and it's the one that proves what the actual variable is. The King Ranch faced the same crisis in the 1930s, a massive estate tax bill after Henrietta King's death, heirs multiplying, the Depression crushing beef prices. What the family did in the mid-1930s was convert the property into a corporation, with the heirs holding stock. That single change rewrites the whole equation. An heir who wants out no longer sues to partition land. They sell shares. The company keeps the ranch. The fences never move. It isn't free, and it's worth being honest about the price. Shares can end up held by descendants who have never worked the place and never will, and a corporation eventually answers to shareholders rather than to a patriarch. King Ranch was under the direction of someone who wasn't a descendant of its founder by 1977. The structure saves the land by loosening the family's grip on it, but it does save the land. Tom Wagoner's 1923 trust was the right instinct with the wrong instrument. He locked the land together but left his descendants holding interests in dirt rather than shares in a business. When they stopped agreeing, the only tool available was the one that breaks things, which is what finally happened. The court ordered the sale. The Wagoner went on the market in August 2014, listed at $725 million, marketed by Bernie Wechtritz of Briggs Freeman Sotheby's International Realty, who called it the Statue of Liberty of cowboy culture. Roughly 50 prospective buyers toured the property. About a dozen written offers came in. Reporting at the time referenced a stalking horse bid around $550 million. On February 9, 2016, Judge Dan Mike Bird permitted the owners to proceed with a private transaction. The buyer was Stan Kroenke, owner of the Los Angeles Rams, married to Ann Walton Kroenke, a niece of Sam Walton. The terms were never disclosed, and I want to be clear about that because you'll see $725 million reported as the sale price constantly. That was the asking price. Representatives involved indicated the family came off that number somewhat, but not dramatically. Anyone stating an exact figure is guessing. It was the first sale in the ranch's history. The acquisition moved Kroenke from the 9th largest private landowner in the United States to the 5th. There's a detail from the closing that stays with me. According to reporting in the Dallas Morning News, when the deal was signed in February 2016, the once warring descendants, the buyers, the brokers, and the lawyers all gathered together to market. Speeches were given in front of a large Art Deco mural about the ranch and its history. One person present described it as feeling like a memorial service, which is roughly what it was. So what did 25 years of litigation actually cost? Legal fees against an estate valued around $330 million for a start, though the true figure isn't public. But the harder cost was time. 2.5 decades in which nobody could make a major long-term decision about a working property because nobody knew who would own it. 25 years of deferred choices on a ranch that operates on generational timelines, and the 15 Camp families, plus everyone else drawing a living from that place, spent those years not knowing who their employer would be. After the sale, there were reports that residents on the property had been told to vacate. I treat that carefully. It was reported, disputed in places, and I don't want to state it as settled fact. What isn't in dispute is that people whose families had spent lifetimes on that ground had no say in any of it. There's a broader trade-off worth naming too. The ranch stayed whole, which is what the family said it wanted, but it stayed whole under a billionaire from Missouri rather than descendants in Vernon. Whether that counts as preservation depends on what you think was worth preserving, the land or the people on it. So come back to those two offices across the hall. What ended in that courtroom in February 2016 wasn't the Wagoner Ranch. The cattle are still there. The fence is still one fence. The oil still comes up. Kroenke Ranches folded it into operations spanning the United States and Canada, and by most accounts, kept the staff and the way the place runs. What ended was the family's ownership of it after roughly 167 years. Poco Bueno is still buried standing up across from the entrance on land the Wagoners no longer own. Here's the question I can't stop turning over. Tom Wagoner saw this coming in 1923 and built a structure specifically to prevent it. He was one of the most sophisticated businessmen in Texas, and he still got it wrong, not because he was careless, but because he protected the land and forgot to protect the relationship between the people who would inherit it. Every great ranch in America is running the same experiment right now. Somewhere, a founder's grandchildren are sitting in separate offices, holding undivided interests in something none of them can divide. The land will be fine. It always is. The question is, whose name is on it in 50 years?